A desperate mother begs for help, and the millionaire's action leaves everyone speechless. Rain whipped down Hope Springs streets, rattling signs and beating on leaky awnings. The neon of the corner grocery flickered, spilling a pale pink glow across puddles. Sarah Miller pulled up the frayed collar of her thin coat, pressing Emily close against her chest. The little girl clutched Mr. Bear, a worn, flat teddy with a frayed ear. Cold crept through Sarah's sleeves and into her bones, stinging like pins. They leaned against the back door of a diner. The metal was slick and cold, carrying the smells of old grease, onions, and smoke. Sarah knocked softly. Inside came the clang of dishes, the growl of a hood fan. Outside, the rain pounded, steady as a tired clock refusing to stop. The door cracked open. A man in a flower-streaked apron looked out. His eyes flicked over them, shoulders stiff. His voice was clipped. "We're closed. Come back tomorrow." Sarah angled her body to shield Emily from the rain. Her voice was hoarse, trembling. "Please, just anything left. My little girl." Emily coughed, hugging Mr. Bear tighter, her lips pale. The man froze a second, gaze caught on the child's tiny fingers gripping the bear. He sighed, muttering like he was scolding himself. "Stay there. Just this once. Don't come back." The door shut. They waited, hunched beneath the shallow overhang. Wind cut through the cracks, gnawing at their backs. Sarah pulled off her gloves, rubbing Emily's cold hands between her own. Somewhere in her mind, a rough voice growled, reeking of liquor. "You embarrassed me in front of everyone?" She forced the echo down, choking back the tremor in her chest. The door opened again. 2 plastic plates were shoved into her arms, soggy noodles, a few limp fries, scraps of meat gone dry. The man jerked his chin. "That's it. Go, thank you," Sarah murmured, crouching to shield the food from the rain. They sat on the damp concrete step, wrapping the plates in a thin plastic bag. Steam rose faintly, smelling of stale oil. Emily looked up at her, trying to smile. Sarah split a plastic fork, offering a piece of potato. The girl touched it to her lips. A pickup tore past. Water splashed up, drenching the step in a filthy wave. Oil spread into thin, broken rainbows. Noodles scattered, swept down the gutter. Sarah only had time to throw her arm around Emily's head. Cold water poured down her neck, into her collar. She lifted her face, mouth parting as if to speak, then shut it again, like an apology stuck on her tongue. "Mom?" Emily whispered, her chest hitching. I can't eat this," Sarah nodded, lips pressed white. It's okay. Headlights cut across the narrow alley. A black sedan eased to the curb, its engine humming low. The window slid down just enough to reveal a man's face. Middle-aged, composed, eyes dark but steady. He didn't stare, didn't pry. "You need a dry place tonight?" His voice was low, gentle, more like laying a blanket than asking. "And, if you'll allow, somewhere safe until she feels better. I can help." Sarah held Emily tighter, swallowing something hot and bitter in her throat. "Thank you, sir. But I don't want to be a burden." Emily coughed, sharp and raw, glancing at the ruined food, then the warm yellow light spilling from the car. She whispered, "Mom, I want somewhere warm." The man looked at the child, then at Sarah. His distance remained, but his voice was steady. "I'm Edward Carter. My home's at the end of this street. I have a car seat in back. I'll drive slow. You don't need to say a word tonight. Just let her be warm." Wind shifted, rain slashing across their faces. Sarah drew a breath. It wasn't surrender, just choosing warmth for her child. "Yes. Thank you." Inside the car, heat streamed from the vents, fogging the glass. Emily curled up, Mr. Bear under her chin, her cheeks turning pink again. Sarah perched on the seat's edge, clutching her worn canvas bag tight against her chest like a shield. Edward bent carefully, fastening Emily's belt, his hands sure and gentle. He sat back, started the engine. Streetlights slid across the glass, streaking Sarah's damp cheek. "You both okay?" he asked softly, eyes on the road. Sarah opened her mouth, then closed it. A small sob escaped. Quick. As if she feared it would be heard, she turned to the window, letting the rain outside blur her answer. "I'm sorry," Edward said quietly. "No need for words tonight. Let's just get you home." Hope Springs receded into the fogged glass. Reflected back at Sarah was a face thin and unfamiliar even to herself. Behind her, Emily sighed once and drifted off. A minimalist iron gate swung open. The gravel drive glistened, lined with bamboo heavy with rain, drops shining under the lights. A broad-shouldered man hurried out with a large umbrella, bowing slightly. "Mr. Carter, storm's rough tonight." "Thank you, Robert," Edward said, shifting to shield Sarah carrying Emily. Under the porch, a middle-aged woman with neatly tied hair was waiting. She held out 2 thick towels, clean and warm. "Dry her off first, dear. The kitchen's warm." Sarah ducked her head. Her hand shook as she took the towel, but steadied as she pressed it against her daughter's hair. Passing close, Rosa Martinez leaned toward Edward, her voice low, meant for him alone. "You've brought someone in again, this late. You know this will trouble you." "I know." Edward's tone was quiet but firm. "But I won't leave them out there." Rosa didn't argue. She pulled the door open, leading mother and child deeper inside. Warm yellow light spread across the wooden table. The gas fireplace ticked gently. The scent of chicken soup, ginger, and celery filled the air, mixing with the clean cotton smell of fresh towels. Emily's eyes widened as she watched the dryer hum, the round glass window spinning like a magic circle. Mr. Bear tumbled slowly inside, his fur sticking up in tufts. "Mr. Bear's going to be warm again," she whispered, her voice less shaky now. Sarah leaned against the wall, her spine measuring every possible way out. Edward set 2 porcelain bowls and small spoons on the table. He stepped back, leaving space between himself and the meal. "Please, have a seat. The living room's right there. The door will always stay open." Rosa laid out a small, pale blue sweater with a round neck. "Put this on her for now. The heater runs hot, she might sweat." "Thank you," Sarah murmured. From the first strangeness in her chest, something warm and frightening now began to rise. Emily held the spoon in both hands, blowing on it. Each swallow of soup eased into her throat like a softer breath. Sarah sat close, watching her daughter's cheeks flush like 2 small flames. When they finished, Sarah automatically gathered the dishes and carried them to the sink. Rosa brushed her elbow gently. "Guests don't wash dishes." "I feel better when I do," Sarah said quietly. Edward lingered at the kitchen doorway, not stepping between them. His voice was still that same soft weight, like a blanket laid over shoulders. "There's a couch in the living room with blankets. If you need privacy, I'll have Robert bring a screen." Sarah nodded, dried her hands, and followed Rosa toward the small bathroom with Emily. Warm water ran, fogging the mirror. Mr. Bear, fresh from the dryer, sat on the counter, fluffed up like a little cloud. Near midnight, wind pressed low through the yard, humming in the bamboo. Sarah curled on the sofa, blanket up to her chin. Emily slept tightly beside her, arms around Mr. Bear, now dry and warm. A tiny tick broke the quiet. Sarah stirred before even opening her eyes. For a moment, the room warped. No soup, no towels, just cheap whiskey and the snap of a belt. "You dare defy me?" She blinked hard. The living room returned. Wooden table, dimmed lamp, white walls. Emily still slept. On the table, her cheap phone buzzed faintly, screen lit. Sarah watched until the ringing stopped. She didn't touch it. Instead, she laid a hand on her daughter's forehead, warm, steady. The faint scent of shampoo clung to her hair, mixed with the trace of rain. The living room door wasn't shut. A small gap remained. Intentional. She realized it wasn't to watch her, but so if she needed to leave, no lock would click behind her. Outside, Hope Springs lay quiet as a wet photograph. At its center, 3 points of light. A yellow lamp, a warm teddy bear, and a door left open. From there, another path began. The morning came without rain. Pale sunlight seeped through the curtains, scattering onto the wood floor in a lattice of light. From the kitchen drifted the smell of fresh coffee and toast, butter melting with a sigh. Rosa Martinez stood ready with 2 folded kitchen towels and a plate of soft scrambled eggs. She set a warm glass of milk in front of Emily, her practiced hand pulling the chair just right. "Eat slowly, your throat's still sore," she said gently. Then, remembering, she pulled a pair of cream-colored wool socks from her basket. "I knit these last night. Try them on." Emily touched the soft yarn with her fingertips, her eyes bright. She looked up, whispering with a smile, "Do they have a name?" "On the heel," Rosa said, writing 2 tiny letters, E.M., in blue ink and blowing lightly to dry it. "Now they're yours." Sarah leaned in the kitchen doorway, rubbing her hands together as if to hold on to warmth. Her clothes were dry, yet the night's chill still lingered along her spine. She slid into the chair beside Emily, watching each bite. When the spoon clinked against the bowl, Sarah startled, then murmured, "Thank you for everything. In this house, we eat first." Rosa smiled. Words can wait. Breakfast carried only the sound of spoons, the low hum of the coffee machine, and the faint whistle of wind in the bamboo. When it was done, Sarah gathered the dishes, placing them in the sink. Rosa stepped close, touching her elbow. "Guests don't wash. I breathe easier when I do," Sarah answered softly, eyes down. Busy hands, quieter mind. Rosa paused, then stepped back. "All right, but I'll wash with you." Warm water ran, misting the small window. Clean dishes clicked on the rack like raindrops. Edward Carter never appeared at the breakfast table. A silver tray sat neatly on the console in the hall. Black coffee, a slice of toast, and a folded newspaper. On the office door's knob hung a dark suit jacket. Passing by, Sarah glimpsed his reflection through the glass, bent over a small framed photo before closing it again. Nothing more. She told herself his silence was kindness. Distance like a quilt. Warm, but not smothering. After breakfast, Emily asked to go outside. Dew still dotted the leaves, sparkling like sugar dust. She stepped carefully along the gravel path, Mr. Bear under her arm, new socks snug at her ankles. The glass wind chime tinkled in the breeze, its notes like marbles tapping. Edward stood at the library window, hand resting on the frame. Light traced deeper lines at his eyes. He watched the girl bend low, trying to touch a dewdrop without making it fall. Somewhere in his chest, an invisible string tugged gently. He placed his free hand over his shirt, pressing the spot where a ring had once left its mark. Then he let it drop, exhaling, shifting aside to turn away from the window. On the doorstep, Sarah stepped out 2 paces and stopped. Her eyes swept along the fence, the camera fixed beneath the eaves, the motion light over the lawn. Last night, the buzz of an unknown number still lingered on her phone screen like a shadow. She pulled her collar tight to her chin, scanning the low shrubs. Nothing unusual. Not safe, but quiet. And quiet spoke its own language. Sarah just wasn't ready to believe it yet. "You can count on the hot water, heat, and plumbing," Rosa said, appearing behind her with a box of tissues in hand. "The thermostat's on the right wall. I keep it at 70. Turn it up if you're cold." Sarah nodded. Rosa went on, her voice lowered as though careful not to bruise the words. "Mr. Carter doesn't talk much, kind in a way that doesn't cross lines. After what happened, he doesn't laugh often, but he knows how to leave the door open." Sarah turned her face away, avoiding Rosa's eyes. "I understand. Thank you for telling me." Rosa said nothing more. She handed Sarah a thin jacket for Emily. "She'll work up a sweat running around. wipe her neck after. By late morning, Emily's cough returned. She tried to swallow it down, her small shoulders shaking. Sarah bent close, pulling a crumpled pack of cheap cough drops from her cloth bag. She unwrapped one, placing it in her daughter's warm palm. "Suck it slowly, don't bite," she instructed, glancing at the empty cough syrup bottle at the bottom of the bag. She twisted the cap, only the ghost of mint and plastic remained. Emily nodded, her cheeks puffed with candy. Mr. Bear sat propped on a chair across from her, as if he, too, were a patient nursing a cough. At noon, as Sarah and Rosa folded towels, a slip of paper appeared under a magnet on the fridge. The handwriting was neat and even. "Appointment, Hope Springs Medical Center, Dr. Stephen Harris, 3 p.m. today. EC, nothing more. No mention of money, no explanation. Just a date, a place, and an initial like a period at the end of a soft sentence." Sarah held the paper for a long while, her thumb tracing its edge. Debt pressed at her, not of money, but of this quiet thoughtfulness that forced her to confront her own pride. She put it back, aligning the edge square with the fridge door, as if the neatness might steady her breathing. "He never writes, 'I'll pay,'" Rosa said, folding the last towel. "He just puts things in place and leaves them there." "I know," Sarah whispered. "I'm just not sure I deserve it." "Everyone deserves love, Sarah," Rosa replied gently. By early afternoon, the sky lightened. Robert pulled the car to the front. Sarah buttoned Emily's coat, fastening each clasp carefully. Emily held Mr. Bear in one hand, the other clutching her mother's sleeve. Passing the library, they glimpsed Edward leaning against the shelves, reading a file. He lifted his eyes for just a moment and gave the faintest nod, like a greeting without sound. Sarah answered with a small nod of her own. Nothing more. The car door closed, leaving the wind outside. That evening, motion lights along the fence blinked on, lining a soft path over wet grass. Sarah stood on the porch, her cheap phone resting in her dry palm. No new messages. A twig broke off an old branch, clattering against the siding. Her heart jumped. Silence followed. She scolded herself, "Don't bow to shadows." Inside, Emily already slept, her nose flushed pink, the new wool socks peeking from under the blanket like two cream dots. Mr. Bear leaned against her shoulder, his plastic eyes fixed toward the door as if keeping watch. Sarah pulled the blanket higher, touching her daughter's forehead. Warm, steady. Before turning out the light, she left the living room door ajar, just like the first night, open enough so the way out never vanished. Outside, the fence lights faded one by one. Darkness gathered again, but inside Sarah, something new stirred, not trust, not yet, but a habit of quiet. It had no name yet, but it was enough for her to close her eyes without feeling herself fall. The next morning dawned clear, the air rinsed clean of last night's rain. On the Carter porch, Robert held the car door open, an umbrella folded in his hand. Edward stood on the step in a gray sweater, speaking low enough for only Robert to hear. "Take them to Hope Springs Medical Center. They'll be more at ease if I don't go along." Robert nodded. Sarah led Emily out, Mr. Bear's worn ear poking from the backpack like a brown eye. The mother whispered thanks, skirting Edward's gaze. As the car door shut, Edward lingered a beat, his hand pressing the pocket where an old photo lay. At last, he turned inside. 10 minutes later, he left again, hailing a taxi down the road. The hospital hallway was so white the light seemed to strip the edges off her lashes. The antiseptic bite hung sharp. Emily pressed her face against the aquarium glass in the waiting room, following a goldfish pushing bubbles toward the surface. Sarah sat at the registration desk, pen trembling as she reached the box for emergency contact. She froze, staring as if at a blank wall, then left it empty. "Miller, Sarah?" the receptionist prompted. "Yes." Sarah handed back the clipboard, her eyes sliding away. The exam room door opened. Dr. Stephen Harris, glasses perched on a thin frame, spoke gently. "Emily Miller?" Emily looked up, her small hand still pressed against the tank. Sarah led her inside, closing the door. The small room bore a growth chart tacked to the wall, its red and green curves soft like ribbons. "Emily's a little underweight for her age, doctor," Harris said, tapping the blue line with his pen. "She shows signs of low iron. Not serious if we intervene in time." Sarah tightened the strap of her cloth bag, her knuckles turning white. Emily sat on the exam table, eyes fixed on the round light above, glowing like a moon. "How's her appetite?" Dr. Harris asked. "She's picky." Sarah struggled to find the words, swallowing dryly. "I've tried." "That's all right. We'll add milk, red meat, leafy greens. I'll prescribe liquid iron. It's not too bad." He smiled, trying to lighten the air. "The real challenge will be getting her to take it." Emily tilted her head. "Does it taste like metal?" Dr. Harris chuckled. "A little, but I'll show your mom how to mix it with apple juice." He turned to the computer, printing the prescription. His last question sounded routine, but it struck right at Sarah's thinnest place. "And your insurance?" Sarah pressed her lips together. "For now, none." The air thinned. "Doctor." Harris nodded, voice staying flat with professional calm. "I'll mark it under assistance. The billing desk will walk you through the rest." The door opened. Sarah helped Emily down. As it closed behind them, the metallic click of the latch rang out, small sound but in Sarah's mind. It dropped her back into another room. The turn of a key, the hiss of a belt through a buckle, a dark hallway, hot alcohol breath at her neck. "Keep your face down." She swayed for a second, clutching her daughter's back like a lifeline. "You're okay, Em," she said aloud, as much to herself as to the child. At the billing desk, plexiglass separated them. The cashier leaned into the microphone. "Total for today." Sarah fumbled through her wallet, the thin rustle of bills humiliating in its smallness. A shadow stretched over her shoulder, a low, steady voice she recognized, landing softly as if on a wooden floor. "Put it on my account, please." Sarah turned. Edward stood there, no tie, his long coat still carrying the smell of wind. When did you get here?" "I was passing by," he said simply. No explanation, no glance at her wallet. She slid the prescription into her bag, managing a hard nod. The thank you caught in her throat. Across from the hospital, a diner played old country songs. The Formica tables glowed under neon pink light. Emily scribbled with a crayon on a paper coaster, sketching a swan with a long neck and crooked wings. "Where's it looking?" Edward asked, as though speaking to the drawing. "Toward the sun." Emily answered without hesitation. Sarah set a glass of water before her daughter, then pulled out a chair diagonal from Edward. The space between them felt measured by an invisible line. He ordered pancakes for Emily, chicken soup for Sarah, black coffee for himself. When the waitress poured his coffee, the bitter warmth lifted immediately into his hands. "You don't owe me," Edward said once the waitress left, his gaze free of pressure. Sarah turned her spoon in the steam, eyes down. "I owe myself independence." Edward nodded, no argument. The faint sound of spoon against porcelain filled the silence like breathing. "Years ago," he began quietly, as if afraid of spilling something fragile, "I came too late." Sarah looked up, for the first time. "Too late? Where?" "At the place I needed to be." His hand tightened on the cup. "A highway accident. My son didn't wait. And after that, my wife couldn't bear it. I couldn't hold her here." Sarah didn't say, "I'm sorry." The words were worn down to nothing. Instead, she set the spoon aside, clasping her hands like prayer. Her eyes softened, the blade-sharp edge of caution gone. "I know that feeling, when you open a door and the whole room has changed places," she whispered, "and you can't find your ground again." Across the table, Emily giggled, biting into her pancake. Syrup dribbled onto her nose. She laughed harder, collapsing against her arm. Sarah rarely laughed too. Small, but enough to crease the corners of her eyes. Edward slid another coaster close, quietly tucking Emily's swan sketch into his leather notebook. The motion was unconscious, like pressing a leaf between pages. Sarah's old phone buzzed in her bag. Unknown caller. She stared a beat too long, then silenced it. Her finger trembled after, as if the phantom ring still echoed. Outside, the sky dimmed. A black Foyne 150 rolled past, streaked with dried mud like claw marks along its side. None of them turned in time to see the driver's face. Only the heavy growl of the engine lingered, dragging like a dirty promise. "Want more butter?" Edward leaned toward Emily. "Yes, please," she said, her voice clearer now after warm soup. Sarah adjusted her daughter's scarf, propping Mr. Bear on the seat like a small wall of fur. She sipped water, catching a metallic tang on her tongue, whether from the spoon or words unspoken. She couldn't tell. "Thank you for earlier," she said at last, eyes on the sugar packets instead of him. "When you're ready," Edward replied. "I'll listen, no questions." "I'll try," she said, as though pushing a heavy door into a thin crack of light. On the ride back, the air smelled of damp pine. Robert pulled under the eaves, opening the back door. Emily hugged her small medicine bottle as if it were treasure. Sarah stepped out, glancing toward the iron fence. Motion lights blinked on, casting long, angled shadows. Edward stood at a polite distance. He didn't touch her arm, only inclined his head. In the fading daylight, his features softened, like a photo left too long in the sun. "We'll mix the medicine with apple juice," he told Emily, deliberately choosing we. "And tomorrow, if you'd like, I'll show you the ducks by the back pond." "Are there swans?" Emily asked, eyes bright again. "No," Edward smiled. "But there's one fat duck that's convinced he's a swan. Not serious if we intervene in time." Sarah tightened the strap of her cloth bag, her knuckles turning white. Emily sat on the exam table, eyes fixed on the round light above, glowing like a moon. "How's her appetite?" Dr. Harris asked. "She's picky." Sarah struggled to find the words, swallowing dryly. "I've tried." "That's all right. We'll add milk, red meat, leafy greens. I'll prescribe liquid iron, it's not too bad." He smiled, trying to lighten the air. "The real challenge will be getting her to take it." Emily tilted her head. "Does it taste like metal?" Dr. Harris chuckled. "A little, but I'll show your mom how to mix it with apple juice." He turned to the computer, printing the prescription. His last question sounded routine, but it struck right at Sarah's thinnest place. "And your insurance?" Sarah pressed her lips together. "For now, none." The air thinned. Dr. Harris nodded, voice staying flat with professional calm. "I'll mark it under assistance. The billing desk will walk you through the rest." The door opened. Sarah helped Emily down. As it closed behind them, the metallic click of the latch rang out. Small sound, but in Sarah's mind, it dropped her back into another room. The turn of a key. The hiss of a belt through a buckle. A dark hallway, hot alcohol breath at her neck. "Keep your face down." She swayed for a second, clutching her daughter's back like a lifeline. "You're okay, Em," she said aloud, as much to herself as to the child. At the billing desk, plexiglass separated them. The cashier leaned into the microphone. "Total for today." Sarah fumbled through her wallet, the thin rustle of bills humiliating in its smallness. A shadow stretched over her shoulder. A low, steady voice she recognized, landing softly as if on a wooden floor. "Put it on my account, please." Sarah turned. Edward stood there, no tie, his long coat still carrying the smell of wind. When did you get here?" "I was passing by," he said simply. No explanation, no glance at her wallet. She slid the prescription into her bag, managing a hard nod. The thank you caught in her throat. Across from the hospital, a diner played old country songs. The Formica tables glowed under neon pink light. Emily scribbled with a crayon on a paper coaster. sketching a swan with a long neck and crooked wings. "Where's it looking?" Edward asked, as though speaking to the drawing. "Toward the sun," Emily answered without hesitation. Sarah set a glass of water before her daughter, then pulled out a chair diagonal from Edward. The space between them felt measured by an invisible line. He ordered pancakes for Emily, chicken soup for Sarah, black coffee for himself. When the waitress poured his coffee, the bitter warmth lifted immediately into his hands. "You don't owe me," Edward said once the waitress left, his gaze free of pressure. Sarah turned her spoon in the steam, eyes down. "I owe myself independence." Edward nodded, no argument. The faint sound of spoon against porcelain filled the silence like breathing. Years ago, he began quietly, as if afraid of spilling something fragile. "I came too late." Sarah looked up, for the first time. "Too late, where?" "At the place I needed to be." His hand tightened on the cup. "A highway accident. My son didn't wait. And after that, my wife couldn't bear it. I couldn't hold her here." Sarah didn't say, "I'm sorry." The words were worn down to nothing. Instead, she set the spoon aside, clasping her hands like prayer. Her eyes softened, the blade-sharp edge of caution gone. "I know that feeling. When you open a door and the whole room has changed places," she whispered. "And you can't find your ground again." Across the table, Emily giggled, biting into her pancake. Syrup dribbled onto her nose. She laughed harder, collapsing against her arm. Sarah rarely laughed too. Small, but enough to crease the corners of her eyes. Edward slid another coaster close, quietly tucking Emily's swan sketch into his leather notebook. The motion was unconscious, like pressing a leaf between pages. Sarah's old phone buzzed in her bag. Unknown caller. She stared a beat too long, then silenced it. Her finger trembled after, as if the phantom ring still echoed. Outside, the sky dimmed. A black Few 150 rolled past, streaked with dried mud like claw marks along its side. None of them turned in time to see the driver's face. Only the heavy growl of the engine lingered, dragging like a dirty promise. "Want more butter?" Edward leaned toward Emily. "Yes, please," she said, her voice clearer now after warm soup. Sarah adjusted her daughter's scarf, propping Mr. Bear on the seat like a small wall of fur. She sipped water, catching a metallic tang on her tongue, whether from the spoon or words unspoken. She couldn't tell. "Thank you for earlier," she said at last, eyes on the sugar packets instead of him. "When you're ready," Edward replied. "I'll listen, no questions." "I'll try," she said, as though pushing a heavy door into a thin crack of light. On the ride back, the air smelled of damp pine. Robert pulled under the eaves, opening the back door. Emily hugged her small medicine bottle as if it were treasure. Sarah stepped out. Glancing toward the iron fence, motion lights blinked on, casting long, angled shadows. Edward stood at a polite distance. He didn't touch her arm, only inclined his head. In the fading daylight, his features softened, like a photo left too long in the sun. "We'll mix the medicine with apple juice," he told Emily, deliberately choosing "we." "And tomorrow, if you'd like, I'll show you the ducks by the back pond." "Are there swans?" Emily asked, eyes bright again. "No," Edward smiled. "But there's one fat duck that's convinced he's a swan." Emily burst into laughter, the sound popping against the porch walls like corn kernels. Sarah looked at her daughter, loosening her grip on the bag's strap. On the steps, the wooden door stood open. She hesitated for half a beat, then stepped inside. Far off, in another place, a phone buzzed inside the pocket of the man driving the black F-150. He didn't answer. He only looked through the windshield at the glowing house, warm as a lantern. Then he started the engine and drove away. In the kitchen, Rosa set a pitcher of apple juice on the counter. As the three of them passed, she spoke to Emily in a voice pitched higher than usual, as though steadying a mother's nerves by proxy. Some things are bitter, but we learn how to drink them sweet. Emily nodded solemnly, hugging Mr. Bear tighter. Sarah glanced at Rosa. Their eyes met across the warm kitchen air, an unspoken reassurance. Outside, the sun slid behind the pines, laying one last golden stripe across the road toward Hope Springs Main Street. In the living room, Edward sat at the edge of a chair, opened his notebook, and touched the swan drawing tucked between its pages. He closed his eyes for 1 second, like pressing his hand to a frozen river, listening for water still moving beneath. Morning in the Carter kitchen smelled of oats and stewed apples. Rosa placed a cast-iron pot on the stove, her wooden spoon circling slowly, tapping the sides in gentle rhythm. Emily stood on a stool, Mr. Bear under one arm, watching bubbles rise like tiny islands. "Want to stir?" Rosa asked, deliberately slow. Emily nodded, shifting the bear to her left arm, taking the spoon with her right. Sarah stood across the counter, adjusting her daughter's scarf, eyes tracking the spoon more than the flame. Edward appeared at the doorway, a coffee cup in hand, his gaze resting on the small scene as though afraid to spill it. He set the cup down, speaking softly enough for Rosa. "Later, I'll take Sarah into town, print some resumes." "I'll pack sandwiches," Rosa replied, turning off the burner. Sarah glanced back, meeting Edward's eyes for a second before looking away. "I'd like to stop at Bluebird Coffee House," she said. "Tess mentioned she might have shifts open." "All right," Edward nodded. "I'll wait in the car." He stepped onto the porch. The damp pine scent lingered. On the mat, faint mud prints, shaped like large boots, stained the edges. Edward crouched, brushing his fingers over the dried grit. He rose without a word. At Bluebird Coffee House, a bell jingled, carrying the aroma of fresh grind. Tess Alvarez stood behind the counter, hair clipped high, a silver bracelet chiming on her wrist. Luis pulled shots, crema swirling golden. "Sarah," Tess smiled, eyes darting to Emily's damp shoes. "Try a 2-hour shift today. Lunch rush." Sarah rolled her sleeves, slid into an apron, tying it firm behind her back. Emily sat at the window, crayons spread out, Mr. Bear propped by her glass. Edward waited outside on the sidewalk, leaning against a lamppost, scrolling his phone to keep space in the small room. Grinders whirred, plates clinked. Sarah wove through tables with trays. A spoon clattered. She bent to pick it up, smiling. Luis jerked his chin, 3 lattes ready. She balanced them out, sweat prickling at her temples but stepped steady. "You've got this," Tess murmured when passing, her palm tapping the tray's edge. "Hot careful." Sarah's phone buzzed in her apron. Unknown caller. She locked the screen with her calloused thumb, pushing it deeper into her pocket. Outside, Edward noticed. He shifted to a shadier spot, changing his angle instead of his presence. 2 hours passed. As the crowd thinned, Tess untied her apron, leaning on the counter. "If you'd like, 3 lunch shifts this week. Hourly pay, tips split. It's a start." Sarah nodded, ducking her head as though dodging sudden wind. Emily tugged her sleeve, handing over a drawing, a coffee cup with wings flying above rooftops. Sarah smiled this time, reaching her eyes. "Thank you," Sarah told Tess. "Thank you." Tess replied, serious. "For showing up when we needed you." On the way back, Robert steered slowly down a leaf-strewn hill. At the steps, a bundle of dried lavender tied with twine lay on the porch. No note, no card. The pale purple had faded to ash. "Flowers for Mom," Emily cheered. Sarah froze mid-step. Her fingers hovered, not touching. A thin, sharp scent rose, not lavender, but scorched leather and stale garage air. "Robert, who left this?" Edward asked, his voice deliberately calm. "I wasn't gone more than 5 minutes, sir," Robert answered, scanning the grounds. His gaze landed on the new mud tracks across the mat. Sarah stepped back. Emily clutched Mr. Bear to her chest. "I don't want it inside," Sarah whispered. "I'm sorry," No need to apologize, Edward said. He signaled Robert. Please dispose of it. Robert nodded, carrying the bundle to the garage bin, tying the bag tight. His footsteps sounded heavier than usual, as though weighed down by air itself. Come inside, Rosa called from the doorway, then glanced quickly at Sarah's face. The ginger tea's hot. The afternoon dragged slowly across the window panes. Emily had dozed off on the couch, her mouth slightly open, her breathing steady. Sarah sat at the dining table, spreading out her papers, writing her name with a blue ink pen on each sheet. The words, Sarah Miller, slowly became a rhythm, a way to keep her hand from shaking. I want to call the police, Edward said as he set his cup down across from her. At the very least. So they'll drive by more often. Sarah looked up, her eyes still soft but her lashes stiff with tension, like a fence bristling upright. If he knows I called, she swallowed, he'll come faster. If he's already come, Edward answered slowly. Then having his name in the record will help you, not hurt you. From the doorway, Rosa slipped in a line, as if talking to someone else but placing it where Sarah could pick it up. Call if you call. The door's bolted, but peace of mind comes from inside. Sarah looked toward the living room, where Emily clutched Mr. Bear, her small hand still resting on her stomach, as though holding a paper boat in place. She turned back, inhaled deeply. All right, but let me talk first, okay? You talk. I'll call, Edward reminded her. Officer Daniel Reyes arrived before sunset. His uniform carried the smell of old rain and the rubber of boot soles. He sat on the edge of a chair, notebook resting on his knee, a ballpoint pen clipped between two fingers. Name and description, Reyes said, voice steady. Jason Miller, Sarah answered, the last two words catching in her throat. Ex-husband, a head taller than me. Drives a black F-150. Has a tattoo, the letter J, on the middle finger of his right hand, Reyes wrote quickly, glancing up only once at the words ex-husband. Do you have any protective order still in effect? Sarah shook her head. Last time I didn't make it that far. That's all right, Reyes said. I'll have patrol drive past here more often this week. But the important thing is you document everything. Messages, missed calls, strange items. Don't open the door if it's just the two of you at home. Rosa placed 3 porcelain mugs on the table. Reyes took a sip, then rose, leaving a business card with his direct line. Anytime you change your mind about filing an emergency order, call me. Don't wait until something happens. Thank you, Sarah said, lips pressed together after the words, as though she wanted them to stay put. At the door, Reyes paused to tap the seashell wind chime hanging from the eaves. It gave a small sound, just enough for the people inside to know the wind had passed. Night fell but never got too dark. Gray clouds hung low. The porch light cast a warm circle. Edward was in his study, door half shut, rereading Dr. Harris's short note in the file. Iron supplement. Follow up in 2 weeks. He tucked Emily's drawing of the winged coffee cup behind the page, the thin paper giving a soft sigh. In the bedroom, Sarah read her daughter the story of the fat duck who believed it was a swan. Emily giggled at the part where the duck tried to spread its wings but lifted itself only the height of a fingertip. When the girl finally slept, Sarah turned off the lamp, but lingered at the doorway, as though waiting for her eyes to adjust to the dark. Close to midnight, the alarm at the side gate clicked once, the motion light flaring on, then fading. Robert stepped out the back door with a flashlight. He made a slow circuit along the fence line, the white beam sweeping across wet grass, a distant engine sound, then silence. When Robert came back in, he carried a manila envelope shoved under the gate. No return address. Edward opened it on the kitchen table. Inside were 3 old photographs. One wedding picture of Sarah in a white dress, Jason's arm linked through hers. One at the park, Emily, still tiny in her stroller. The third, a copy of Emily's birth certificate, father's name, Jason Miller. On the envelope's edge, dark mud streaks, and a small scrap of paper, scrawled in marker, talk, no more running. Edward laid the photos in a straight line, like evidence arranged for an invisible trial. Sarah stood in the kitchen doorway, her hands clamped to the frame as if holding onto a tree in the wind. She stared at the three images, her own face in the wedding dress smiling too brightly, a smile that no longer belonged to her. "Do you want me to keep this, or burn it?" Edward asked, his voice even. Sarah drew in a long breath, holding it in her chest like a diver before submerging. Then she let it out slowly. "Keep it, to file with the petition." From a distance, Rosa gave a small nod not to Edward, but to Sarah's decision. "Tomorrow I'll go with you to the courthouse," Edward said, "just to sit in the back row." Sarah looked at him, and for the first time her gaze didn't flinch away. Her shoulders lowered half an inch, like a stone dropping from her pocket. "All right," she said, "but I'll be the one to sign." "Yes," Edward answered, "you sign." Outside, the wind stirred the seashell chime, two thin notes like glass striking together. In the living room, Mr. Bear slumped on Emily's shoulder, its frayed ear covering half her smiling face. Before switching off the kitchen light, Sarah gathered the resumes she'd signed, stacking them beside Emily's drawing of the winged cup. Side by side, the two fragile things looked almost like real wings. Morning in the Carter house began with the kettle clicking to a boil. Sarah woke before the clock, standing in the kitchen in a thick sweater, both hands wrapped around an empty mug as though it were something warm. The papers Edward had lined up last night were still on the table. Wedding photo, park photo, birth certificate. Beside them lay the signed job applications, and Emily's drawing of the flying cup. Everything lay flat, only her chest did not. Edward came in, opened the cupboard, and took out ginger tea bags. He didn't ask if she'd slept. He simply poured the water, waited for the steam to rise, then slid the cup toward her. "Here's the full translation of your passage into natural American English, faithful to grammar, tone, and cultural nuance, aimed especially at a 55-plus American reader. I've preserved all details, without shortening or embellishing." "We should head out early today," he said, lowering his voice as if speaking in a library. "Better to avoid the courthouse rush." Sarah nodded. In her throat, an invisible knot slipped loose, like a stubborn thread sliding free of a needle. Upstairs, Emily stirred awake at the faint chime of the seashell wind bells outside the porch. She shuffled down the stairs in her fuzzy slippers, clutching Mr. Bear, the frayed ear covering one eye. She leaned against her mother's knees and looked up. "Where are we going, Mommy?" "Mommy has to take care of some papers," Sarah said, smoothing her daughter's hair. "You'll stay with Miss Rosa. I'll be back by lunch." Emily rubbed Mr. Bear's nose against her mother's wrist, as though stamping an invisible seal. Rosa had already made apple cinnamon porridge. Robert held the car door open through the pale morning mist on the lawn. The small entry bell gave a single ring as they stepped out. River County Courthouse rose like a square block of limestone on Main Street. Inside, fluorescent lights drained every color by a shade. The metal detector beeped when a man forgot to take off his belt. Sarah stood in line, gripping her bag strap until her knuckles whitened. Edward kept exactly one step behind her, not closer, not farther. When her turn came, she slipped off her plastic bracelet, set her phone in the tray. The security officer gave the same thin smile to everyone. Beyond the checkpoint, the smell of new paper mixed with floor cleaner. A tape sign read "Domestic Violence. Ex parte." Its corner peeling. The room was small, like a makeshift classroom. A long table pressed against the wall. A dark-haired woman with her hair tied high looked up, smiling with her eyes. "I'm Anna Patel, volunteer legal aid. You need the emergency protective order forms, right?" Sarah nodded, sat on the edge of the chair. Anna slid a stack of papers toward her. "Fill in what you can. I'll guide you through the rest. Pens here." The scratched plastic table surface rasped under the ballpoint tip. At the line for description of incident, Sarah paused longer than anywhere else. The blue ink moved in uneven strokes, some heavy, some faint. "Last August. Grabbed my wrist hard, Threw my phone against the wall, threatened to take my daughter if I defied. She didn't write what didn't need to be written. She wrote just enough for them to understand. Name of the person to be restrained? Anna asked. Jason Miller. Tall. Tattoo. Letter J. On the middle finger of his right hand. Drives a black F-150. Anna nodded, underlining the identifiers. I know this is hard, she said, not raising her voice, not lowering it. But each line is a brick. You're building a wall. Edward sat on the bench by the wall, hands folded in front of him. He didn't look at the form. He watched the wall clock that lagged 3 minutes behind, holding silence like a prayer. When she finished, Anna clipped the pages into a manila folder, handed it to Sarah for one last check. We'll file right now. If the judge is available, you'll see him this morning. Sarah nodded. She rose, her knees suddenly light, as if they didn't belong to her. In the long hallway, the rubber soles of staff blended with the clack of pens. The temporary hearing room had no jury, just chairs, a flag, and a wooden gavel. The judge, gray-haired and wearing half-frame glasses, looked up as Sarah entered, giving a small motion to sit. You are Sarah Miller? He asked, voice round and weary. Yes. I've read your petition. Do you wish to add anything? Sarah opened her mouth, careful not to let her words fall away. I don't want him near my daughter. I want her to go to school without having to look over her shoulder. A very short silence. Beside her, Anna tilted her head at an angle no one else saw. Edward looked down at his polished shoes, untouched by mud. The temporary protective order is granted, the judge said, signing. No contact within 300 feet. No communication in any form. A full hearing in 14 days. Service of process by police. The scratch of pen on paper sounded like a rope being pulled tight. Sarah nodded her thanks, rising slowly, as though standing after a fainting spell. Out in the hallway, she leaned back against the wall for a moment. The wall was cool. She felt her fingers trembling just enough to remind her that blood was moving again. Officer Reyes will get a copy this afternoon, Anna said, gathering the papers. Keep one copy with you, and one at your daughter's school. Thank you, Sarah said. This time the words stayed in place. Edward stepped close enough that his voice wouldn't carry. Do you want to eat something? Head back to Bluebird? Bluebird, Sarah replied. I need to talk to Tess about my shifts. At noon, Bluebird Coffee House felt warmer than usual. Tess set a cinnamon muffin in front of Sarah. For someone who's had a hard day, she said, retreating to the counter. Luis adjusted the mic on the small speaker. He strummed a few bare notes, the melody like footsteps in snowlight, but leaving marks. You can leave a copy here, Tess said, nodding at the folder Sarah held. Just in case, Sarah understood. She pulled out a copy of the order, handed it to Tess. Tess didn't read it. She slipped it into a plastic sleeve, labeled it with a marker, for Sarah, practical steps, like stitching a seam. Emily drew at the small side table, this time a house with a locked door and a little garden. She added a wind chime with a few thin strokes. This one rings when the wind comes, she said, her voice small but firm. Yes, Sarah answered, hearing herself strangely calm. When the wind comes. Luis bent down, pointing at the corner of the page. Add a little bird on the roof, Emily. A storm bird. But also the bird that brings clear skies after. Emily giggled, dotting the page with a blue pencil. Uncle Edward, I'll draw you a scarf, she said, holding out a crayon, certain he would agree. Edward didn't correct her that he wasn't wearing a scarf today. He simply stood still while she sketched a long blue line around his neck on the paper. In the afternoon, they stopped by the preschool before heading home. Lila, Emily's teacher, skimmed through the protective order quickly, her eyebrows pulling together for a moment. I'll give a copy to the office, Lila said, and I'll update the pickup list. Only you, Miss Rosa, and Mr. Edward. All right? All right, Sarah replied. His name, standing next to hers, sounded ordinary in a way that surprised her. Lila bent down to greet Emily, whispering, "Tomorrow, let's make wind chimes out of straws for the whole class, okay?" Emily nodded, eyes bright. Back home, Robert began installing an extra chain lock on the back door. Rosa taped a note inside the kitchen cabinet, the letters written large. "When something happens, 911, call Reyes, call Tess, pick up Emily." Beneath it, Sarah added a private code just for her and Emily. "Honey spilled," meaning, hide in the storage room, lock the door. Emily practiced saying it like a poem, each time smaller, until it was only a breath. A text came in, unknown number. "Talk, Sarah, just once." No direct threat, no apology. The smell of an old garage seemed to cling to each word. "Don't answer," Edward said. "Leave everything on the machine." Sarah set the phone face down. She walked to the dining table, where the file Anna had clipped together that morning still lay neat. She smoothed her hand over the corner of the papers, the way one might smooth a wrinkle on a bedsheet before laying a child down to sleep. "I'm still taking the noon shift tomorrow," she said, as if announcing it to her own spine. "Okay," Edward replied. "I'll sit at the window table." "You don't have to. I want Luis's coffee." He smiled faintly, and to color in the scarf a bit more. Sarah laughed, the sound so clear Emily turned from the living room and smiled back on instinct. The laughter warmed the panes of glass. Night fell, cold but not sharp. Reyes called. "I've received the order. I'll handle service. Tonight, a patrol car will pass your house 3 times." The words, "pass your house," felt like a blanket wrapped around the porch. After Emily was asleep, Sarah carried a teacup out to the porch. The round glow of the lamp cast a yolk-colored circle on the wooden floor. The seashell wind chime rang twice, softly. From the kitchen, Edward brought out a plate of cookies, setting it down without pulling out a chair. "Strange," Sarah said after a long quiet. "Nothing ended today, but I feel like I've started to breathe deeper." "Some doors can only be closed with paper," Edward said, "but paper is still a door." Sarah looked back into the kitchen, at the note-taped eye, level inside the cabinet. She nodded once, a nod for no one but herself. "Tomorrow I'll take Emily to school," she said. "Then go to work. On the way back, let's stop at the post office. I want a P.O. box in my own name." "All right," Edward answered. "A mailbox for birthday invitations." Sarah looked at him. This time she didn't dodge the small joke. "Whose birthday?" "Emily's. And the birthdays of ordinary days." Before going inside, Sarah reached up and touched the wind chime. It gave a single note, like the start of a song. In the living room, Mr. Bear rested his head on a picture book, the frayed ear no longer hiding the stitched smile. At the dining table, the protective order lay neatly beside Emily's drawing of the coffee cup with wings 2 fragile things leaning close, as though they had agreed to keep each other from blowing away when the wind rose. That morning, Bluebird opened early. Tess rolled up the metal shutter, cold air rushing in with the smell of damp iron and warm butter. Moisture still clung to the counter. Out of habit, Sarah dabbed each droplet with a cloth, like soothing a child after tears. She hung up her coat, tied back her hair, breathed deep. Cinnamon, cocoa, roasting coffee scents that had saved her on countless mornings. Edward sat at his usual spot by the window, the newspaper still folded. He didn't read it, didn't pretend to be busy. He was simply there. The way he set his espresso cup on its saucer light, exact, made Sarah's chest steady 1 notch more. Luis tested the mic, a small pop followed by a few warm chords, like a scarf draped over one's shoulders from behind. On the inside counter, Tess clipped a clear envelope labeled in blue ink. For Sarah. Inside was a copy of the protective order, thin, flat, but stubbornly firm. Sarah touched its edge with her fingertip, the chill like the iron railing on the porch outside. "Let me make it today," she said, voice even. "I want to redo the thin foam recipe." Thin foam, but not fragile. Luis smiled. An old joke, but it made everyone breathe easier. The doorbell jingled. Reyes stepped in, brushing a few snowflakes off his cap. He placed both hands on the counter, speaking just loud enough for the one who needed to hear. The order was served at 7:30. He didn't sign. Walked away. The first 24 to 48 hours he's most likely to react. Keep the phone on you. Answer only 911, or my number. Sarah nodded. Her hand unconsciously smoothed the coaster flat. Thank you, she said. I'll write everything down. Reyes left a fresh card. The ink was still wet, deep blue. I'll swing by every hour. If you see a black F-150 parked too long, call right away. I've already put out a patrol alert. He said goodbye and left. Louis struck a brighter set of chords, like switching on another light in the kitchen. Tess slid half a muffin toward Sarah. Sarah ate it crumb by crumb. Her mouth tasteless, but her stomach no longer hollow. By noon, the cafe was crowded. Sarah moved smoothly between the grinder's hum, the pull of levers, the soft clink of cups against saucers. Each time the doorbell chimed, she still startled. But her eyes found Edward, saw his small nod, and her heart settled again. Tess didn't ask, "Are you okay?" She only stepped in at the machine now and then, 5 minutes at a time, like putting a hand on the wheel while a friend changes the radio station. At 1:17, the phone buzzed. Unknown caller. Sarah let it ring out, then opened the small notebook Anna Patel had given her the day before, and wrote, 1:17 p.m., unknown, no answer. The letters stood straight, decisive, thin paper that became a door. Just as Edward always said. Afternoon fell, snow dusting down like sifted flour. Sarah flipped the sign to closed. The cafe grew sparse. Chairs scraping tile loud as brakes. Through the window, the parking lot shimmered with white streaks. In the far corner sat a dark shape, still as held breath. Tall truck bed, long front end. Sarah's palms grew damp, unsure whether from sweat or from cleaning water left behind. F-150, Edward murmured, as though reminding himself to name it right. Luis pulled back the curtain, license plates caked in mud, rear windows got a team sticker. Inside, Tess said calmly, like reminding someone to take bread out of the oven. She slid the bolt, dropped the bar. Edward watched the back. Luis, call Reyes. Sarah backed into the storeroom, her spine pressed against the shelf of paper cups, the damp cement smell of cartons mixing with cinnamon. She suddenly remembered that first afternoon bringing Emily into Bluebird. The child dipping her finger into powdered sugar, leaving a white dot on her cheek. The memory fell over her like a dry towel, softening the shiver. Outside, the truck engine roared, then cut. Silence. A figure leaned against the vehicle, too far to see the face, but close enough to feel where the gaze landed. Sarah's hand went to her pocket, the small notebook stiff against her thigh. She didn't open it. A patrol siren rose in the distance, 2 short wails, 1 long. The truck engine started, reversed, pulled away. By the time Reyes pulled in, only 2 tire tracks marked the snow. Tonight we'll increase patrols, Reyes said after checking the cameras. You follow me home. Red lights, keep going. Stay on speaker. Tess laid a hand on Sarah's back for a moment, warmth running straight up her spine. Go. I'll hold down this place. Thank you, Sarah said. The thank you landed heavy, like an actual object. The Carter house was warm and smelled of wood. Rosa hung a small brass bell on the back door. Robert tightened motion sensors into place. Emily lined up plastic blocks as a fence around Mr. Bear, humming her class song. New game, Sarah said, crouching to eye level. If the bell goes ding ding ding, we crawl under the table. If it goes ding dong, we hide in the storage room. Password still honey spilled. I remember. Emily nodded, solemn as if sworn to a secret mission. Edward brought out an old corded landline. Private line. No one else has this number. It stays in the kitchen. How long have you kept that thing? Sarah asked with a thin laugh. Since paper was still gold, he replied, his eyes smiling too, small jokes just enough to ease the weight. A text from Reyes. I'm parked at the corner, call if needed. Short as a thin blanket across the knees, but still warm. The next morning, the school gate had an extra guard. Lila, clipboard in hand, stepped aside when she saw Sarah. This morning a man asked, "Does Emily go here?" I told him to wait in the office, then hit the buzzer. He left. The camera caught a J tattoo on his finger. I've sent it to Reyes. Sarah's neck flushed hot, then cold. She signed the clipboard, drew a deep breath, bent down to straighten Emily's scarf. The child pressed a smiley face sticker onto her mother's hand, then ran inside, calling back with puckered lips. Wind chime, right? Sarah made 2 fingers into a little chime. Emily grinned and disappeared through the blue door. Thin ice glazed the sidewalk. Each step Sarah took sounded crisp, like a pencil marking a line. She unlocked Bluebird. The doorbell chimed round and clear. Tess handed her an apron. No questions, only a bill to check. Concrete tasks, needing eyes more than heart, exactly what Sarah was grateful for now. At 2:45, a voicemail came through. A man's voice, hoarse but steady. Sarah, we need to talk. I'm standing outside where you can see me. I won't do anything. Just 5 minutes. She didn't replay it. She filed it under archive, wrote down the time. Then she turned on the espresso machine, watched the pressure needle climb to its mark. The coffee poured out even, honey-colored. Want to take a break? Edward asked softly. No. Sarah shook her head, eyes on the stream. I'll finish this batch. That afternoon, Robert brought Emily back. The girl ran straight into the kitchen, holding up 2 straws tied with string. Miss Lila taught us to make wind chimes. I made 2. One for home, one for the cafe so Mr. Luis can hear it. Perfect. Edward bent so Emily could hang one on his finger. I'll find the spot where the wind's just right. Sarah stood on the porch watching her child. Her reflection blurred on the glass. A woman in a flower, dusted apron, hair tied back, hands still smelling of coffee. She remembered Edward's words. Some doors can only be closed with paper. She added her own thought. Paper can be string too, tying down what might blow away. The phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. I'm sorry. You know I'm not a bad man. Sarah set the phone down, didn't answer. She opened the notebook, wrote a new line, then closed it. Emily ran over, shoved Mr. Bear into her mother's hands. Hold him for me, she said firmly. I'm going to wash up. Mr. Bear felt heavier in Sarah's hands not because of the stuffing, but because of the trust. She held him close, listening to the straw wind chime they'd just hung on the porch. It sounded thin but cheerful, like the scratch of a pen signing a small, important decision. That night, after the lights had dimmed, a text came from Reyes. He stopped by the school, read the pickup rules carefully. We're watching. Sarah typed, thank you, erased it, and sent a thumbs up instead. Enough meaning, fewer words. Outside, the breeze was light. Sarah stepped out to adjust the string so the chime wouldn't ring too loudly and startle the child. She looked down at the tiles. Pale white grout lines running side by side, the same boundaries she and her daughter had drawn these past days. At the cafe, at the school, at home, in the phone, on paper. None were thick, but all were steady. She went inside, slid the bolt. On the table, the notebook lay open. Sarah picked up the pen. Today, worked the afternoon shift. Didn't answer. Saved voicemail. Call 911 if. Emily made a wind chime. Sounds happy. The period landed soft, like setting a cup exactly on the ring its condensation left behind. In the living room, Edward pulled a blanket over Emily. He looked up. For a second their eyes met no words, yet both knew tomorrow would begin again with the kettle's hiss, the small chime at the porch, and the paper standing tall in its place. Outside, the wind slanted. The chime didn't slam the wall. It rang just enough, like the last heartbeat of a long day finally finding its ground. The next morning, dew clung like beads to the bluebird sign. Sarah unlocked the back door, still pausing the extra second to hear the firm click. Before she could switch on the light, her nose caught the scent of damp cardboard mingled with powdered sugar, the smell of a rainy day memory. On the step sat a brown paper box, tied with a thin blue string. She didn't touch it. "Tess?" she called into the dim. "I'm here," Tess answered, stepping out with butter still on her hands, flashlight sweeping the lid. Luis poked his head from the storeroom, guitar still slung on a frayed strap. The three of them formed a cautious triangle. Sarah slipped on gloves, slid a finger under the lid, and lifted just enough to see inside. A green plastic dinosaur. Chipped at the head, scratched along the back. She recognized it instantly. It had been in the old toy chest at the place they'd fled from last month. Alongside was a torn sheet of graph paper, words slanted, "Come home." No one said, "Don't be scared." Tess only exhaled slowly. Luis texted Reyes, then leaned his guitar against the grinder, as if it too needed to stand firm. Reyes arrived quickly, cold air still clinging to his jacket. He pulled on gloves, slid the box into an evidence bag. "Cameras in the back, catch anything?" he asked. "Just a shadow and a hood," Luis said, already checking files. But the walk, it looked familiar. Sarah felt her throat click as she swallowed. Reyes glanced at her, voice steady like an airline safety script, but his eyes held warmth. Texts, dropped objects, voicemails, all of it is behavioral evidence. You don't need to answer a single thing, just log the time. The temporary hearing set for early next week. Anna Patel will call you this afternoon. Sarah nodded. Thanks, given only with her eyes. When Reyes left, Tess slid a mug of hot cocoa towards Sarah, not asking, not advising, just placing weight in her hands to stop them from shaking. By midday, Bluebird thrummed with voices. Sarah moved like a shuttle, tamping, pulling shots, spreading milk foam thin as paper. Each time the doorbell rang, her heart jumped. Then she'd glance toward Edward at his usual spot, see him lift his eyes and nod just that, and her pulse steadied back into her hands. Around 3, the crowd thinned. Anna Patel arrived in a dark gray coat, hair clipped back. She didn't open her laptop right away, but set a blue fountain pen on the table, like a pledge. "We need 3 things, Sarah," Anna said softly, her voice carrying just enough over the hum of the glass washer. 1. The behavior record texts, the box, calls. 2. Witnesses Tess, Luis, Miss Lila, Officer Reyes. 3. Current boundaries locks, cameras, patrol schedule. I'll file for an expanded protective order under Section 4B. You don't have to speak a word to him. Sarah stared at the blue pen, thought of the white grout lines at Edward's house. "Can I stand before the judge and keep it short?" she asked, her voice suddenly rough. "Not a story, just what matters." "The shorter, the stronger." Anna nodded. "He left my child's old toy at my workplace door at 6:07 a.m. I saw it. I reported it. I'm afraid. That alone is clear." Edward sat at the next table, newspaper half open. He didn't step into the talk, only raised a hand when Luis brought more water. But when Anna rose, he folded the paper, spoke like marking a calendar. "I can testify that he loitered by the parking lot yesterday. And about the new security measures at the house, nothing more." Anna smiled with her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Carter." Few words, placed right. The judge will like that. After school, the preschool gate was full of balloons rubbing together with squeaks. Emily darted over like a sparrow, stopping at the yellow line until Sarah opened her arms. "Look what I drew today," Emily said, pulling out a crayon picture, a slightly tilted house, 3 stick figures, and a brown bear. "This is you." She pointed to the stick figure with a tied-up ponytail. "This is me. And this one, I don't know how to spell his name yet." Sarah placed a hand on her daughter's head, her own edges softening, then looked up. Lila stood a step away, holding a small envelope. "This is the updated pickup list," Lila said slowly. eyes gentle. I added Mr. Carter under emergency. If anyone else shows up, we'll call you first. Thank you, Sarah replied, her voice steadier than she expected. Emily snapped her fingers in the air. Tonight I'll hang the wind chime on my door, okay, Mom? Yes, Sarah nodded, so it can sing and call in good dreams. Her voice was hoarse but steady. 6:07 a.m. At the back door of Bluebird Cafe. I found a cardboard box. Inside was my daughter's old toy, along with a handwritten note. Come home. I called the police immediately. I was afraid. The judge nodded slightly. Thank you. Brief, sufficient. The side door opened, and a familiar figure appeared. David, her ex-husband. Wrinkled shirt, bloodshot eyes. Sarah didn't turn away, but her spine felt locked in ice. He tried a crooked smile. His voice defensive. I just wanted the little girl to remember her father. I never meant to hurt anyone. Anna stepped forward, her voice cold as steel. Your actions have already crossed the line. This is no longer memory. This is intimidation. The room tightened. Edward leaned slightly forward, as if to add weight to Anna's words. Tess squeezed Sarah's hand under the table, fingertips still dusted with flour. Sarah lifted her head, drew in a breath, and let her voice carry once more. I don't want my child to grow up in fear. I only want her safe. The judge struck the gavel. The extended protection order is in effect immediately. Mr. David Johnson, you are prohibited from approaching Sarah or Emily within 300 feet. Any violation will result in immediate arrest. The crack of wood landed like a temporary period. Sarah sat down. Chest rising fast. Anna gripped her shoulder, whispering, We've just taken a long step forward. Out in the white-lit hallway, Edward came close. He didn't speak, just opened his arms as if waiting. Sarah hesitated a beat, then let herself lean into them, not completely, but enough to draw her first deep breath in months. Reyes nodded and walked away. Tess and Luis hurried ahead to ready the car. Anna straightened the file, smiling tired but satisfied. Sarah touched her pocket. Felt Mr. Bear. She told herself silently, Sweetheart, today Mama said enough. Outside the windows, sunlight spread thin. A new morning, still full of worry, but this time, they were not standing alone. By late afternoon, the fading light draped across the city's old buildings. Sarah held Emily's hand tight as they walked slowly down the alley toward their apartment. The air was lighter, but her shoulders still held tension, as though she couldn't yet believe the order truly protected them. Emily looked up at her mother, voice bright and certain. Mom, today you were so strong. I'm proud of you. Sarah smiled wearily, bending to kiss her daughter's forehead. Because of you, I made it this far. At the corner, Edward was waiting. Not with his usual reserve, he held a small birthday cake. Candle, already planted. Emily squealed, rushing to him. Uncle Edward? Her eyes widened with a mix of joy and surprise. You remembered my birthday? Sarah paused a few steps back, her heart tightening, then loosening. Edward knelt to Emily's level, carefully offering the cake. A late wish, but a true one. Happy birthday, brave little one. The flame flickered in the gentle wind. Emily closed her eyes and whispered, I wish Mommy will always smile. Then blew it out. Sarah turned away, tears stinging. One by one, Anna, Tess, Luis, and Rosa arrived, as if planned. Each carried something small, a pastry box, a book, a cloth doll. They formed a quiet circle around Sarah and Emily, saying little, only smiling, only being there. Reyes came too, his coat still carrying the smell of smoke, but his eyes warmed when he saw Emily clutching Mr. Bear and laughing out loud. This time, young lady, he said gently, your bear doesn't have to stand guard alone. Sarah looked at them all, and it felt like a thick fog inside her chest had finally lifted. The image of David dimmed, no longer a shadow pressing down, just a closed chapter. Edward stepped closer, not pushing, not rushing. He stood beside her, silent a moment before speaking softly. Family isn't always the place we're born. It's the place we choose to belong. Sarah swallowed hard, eyes wet. She didn't answer, only reached out her hand. Edward took it, firm and warm. Emily looked up, grinning, and blurted out without hesitation, "Daddy Edward." At that moment, Sarah broke down, but this time, in joy. She knew the road ahead still held challenges, but they would never face them alone again.